Welcome to Estimating the Economic Impact of Flooding on Historic Properties, Module 5 of MHT's presentations on integrating cultural resources into hazard mitigation planning. This module will provide 3 different methods for estimating the replacement value of a historic property and provide methods for determining other costs involved in estimating the total economic impact of flooding on historic properties. By the end of this presentation, you should know the key terms related to property assessment, understand the context behind developing costs associated with flood damages, and know how to estimate the loss to the structure, loss of contents, displacement time, and loss of function to arrive at a total cost of the flood-related impacts to your historic structures. The planning process for developing a hazard mitigation plan for cultural resources mirrors that of developing a local hazard mitigation plan. Once you've identified the historic properties in your community that are at risk to flooding, and you've conducted a risk assessment to quantify how flooding will impact those properties, the next step is to determine the economic impact of flooding on those properties. This presentation will focus on estimating the potential economic impact of flooding on historic properties. Before delving into the how and why of estimating losses, there are terms that should be understood prior to beginning the loss estimation process. This slide depicts the National Flood Insurance Program's definition of historic structures, which can be found in Title 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 59. Communities that have adopted floodplain management regulations are using this definition. Knowing what is and isn't a historic structure in the regulatory framework is important when planning flood mitigation activities because there are extra regulatory reviews for historic properties that are built into the grants funded with federal dollars. Basically, any property that does not meet the National Flood Insurance Program's definition of historic is subject to floodplain regulations. However, not all buildings in a community have been historically and architecturally evaluated for their eligibility for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Buildings that appear to be potentially eligible for inclusion in the National Register should be considered historic under the National Flood Insurance Program's definition, and therefore may be exempt from meeting floodplain regulations. The 50-year rule isn't a rule so much as a guideline. It was established to assure historical perspective and avoid judgments based on current or recent popular trends when evaluating eligibility for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Properties less than 50 years of age must be exceptionally important to be considered eligible for listing. You'll need to know what these terms mean when you start digging into assessment information and insurance information. Improvement and real property are real estate terms, and loss is an insurance term. These terms are related to estimating the economic impact of a natural hazard. Building cost data references are used in cost estimating. Displacement time and functional downtime are terms associated with disaster recovery. Of the two terms, displacement time applies to both residential and non-residential property, whereas functional downtime applies only to non-residential property. Both are necessary for estimating the total loss for a hazard event. These 3 interrelated terms are at the heart of estimating losses to a structure. It is very important to understand the distinctions between assessed, appraised, and fair market value. Assessed value will almost always be lower than fair market value. It is an estimate determined by local or state government as a means for determining how much property tax the property owner should pay. Appraised value is based on the opinion of an individual, the home appraiser, who looks at the fair market value and adjusts the value of the improvement based on the condition and features of the house, like custom built-in cabinetry, marble flooring, or other unusual materials that go beyond the typical pine wood flooring and gypsum board walls. In Maryland, residential real property assessments are based on the fair market value of a property. There are 2 approaches to determining the assessed value of a property, the sales approach and the cost approach. The Maryland Department of Assessment and Taxation uses a blended approach to determine the value of a residential property. The land is valued using the sales approach, and improvements, which are buildings or dwellings, are valued according to the cost approach. The definition of replacement cost is the cost necessary to repair or replace a building. For newer homes, this is not a difficult cost to estimate because building codes and mass production of materials have standardized the construction industry. Many newer building components can easily be replaced with off-the-shelf materials available in hardware stores. The replacement cost of a historic building is worth more than the sum of its parts. Historic buildings are unique. The materials used in a historic building's construction may no longer be available and may be superior to off-the-shelf materials available now. Historic buildings constructed prior to 1920 were custom built on site and may contain custom features like built-in shelving, built-in seating, crown molding, carved banisters supported by turned balusters, and other decorative and functional features. Mid-century modern buildings may have been constructed with experimental materials that may not be easily replicated. For these reasons, estimating the replacement cost of a historic building is more than a one-to-one cost. The replacement cost must capture the nuances of the building, its uniqueness, and the skill and materials used in its construction. The total loss or amount of damages for a natural hazard event includes all structures that would be affected by that event. The total loss is equal to the sum of the structure loss, which are the building damages, plus the contents loss, plus the loss of function for commercial properties, plus the displacement costs to residents and to business owners to relocate while their damaged property is uninhabitable. You should be estimating losses to historic properties in conjunction with your local emergency management department as part of the planning team who is updating the local hazard mitigation plan. Estimating structure loss for non-historic buildings is relatively straightforward because the value used for the building's replacement value is either the assessed value or the fair market value. In Maryland, the assessed value of an improvement is equal to the fair market value of the property. The estimated damages are expressed as a percentage of a property's replacement value. Going back to our previous example, according to the FEMA Flood Building Loss Estimation Table, a one-story building with no basement that is inundated with 5 feet of floodwaters will incur a 30% loss of its total replacement value. This is the percent damaged. For a building whose replacement value is $100,000, multiply that by the percent damaged, which is 30%, to get the structure loss, which is equal to $30,000. Remember that in Maryland, the assessed value of an improvement is based on the cost approach, which is based on the fair market value. As mentioned earlier, determining replacement costs for historic buildings is problematic due to their uniqueness, lack of availability of materials, superior quality of those materials, custom features, and construction skills that may not be commonly practiced. All of these factors are difficult to quantify. Here are two different methods for estimating the structure loss for historic buildings. Method 1 can be found in FEMA publication number 386-6, Integrating Historic Properties and Cultural Resource Considerations into Hazard Mitigation Planning, which is the 6th volume in FEMA's State and Local Mitigation Planning How-To Guide. Estimating the replacement cost for a building begins by using a construction cost data reference to develop the estimate. To begin creating your estimate, you select a category of building, and then you modify that cost by adding the cost for the building's square footage based on the building's structural system, and finally by adding the cost of the building's special features like chimneys or porches. This is the base or replacement cost of a building. Once you've determined the base cost, because the cost of labor, materials, and equipment vary from one jurisdiction to another, you need to adjust the base cost to reflect the economic conditions in your jurisdiction. This is done by using a location multiplier. A generic location multiplier is also provided for areas that lack their own specific multiplier. The base cost multiplied by the location multiplier will give you the location-specific cost. A second multiplier should be used to account for the unique nature of historic buildings. This multiplier is usually expressed as a percentage, such as 10%. There is no standard percentage to apply for the historic multiplier. If your jurisdiction has an active historic preservation commission, they should be able to provide guidance on an appropriate multiplier based on their experience with the rehabilitation and restoration of historic buildings. Multiplying the location-specific cost by the historic multiplier will give you the replacement value of the historic building. This is the value that should be used in the formula at the top of the slide to calculate the structure loss of the building. The City of Annapolis developed a specific formula to quantify the structure loss for the affected area covered by the city's Cultural Resources Hazard Mitigation Plan. The risk assessment conducted for the buildings in the affected area by flooding estimated a flood depth of 8.2 feet, which is the base flood elevation of 4.5 feet plus another 3.7 feet to account for sea level rise by the year 2050. With this depth of flooding, floodwaters will damage the first floor of buildings in the affected area, so this method only calculates damages done to the first floor of the buildings. A jurisdiction can develop its own method to calculate replacement value, so long as that method is logical, equally applied to all historic buildings, and defensible. Once you've estimated the damage to the building, you should estimate the damage to the building's contents. Contents are items like furniture, personal effects, retail if it is a business, appliances, and basically anything in the building that is not part of the building. Prior to estimating the value of the content loss, you must first estimate the replacement value of the contents. Bear in mind that this is an estimate. The table used in this slide is from HAZUS. The table is the default contents value as a percentage of structure value and was taken from FEMA's guidance for flood risk analysis and mapping. Flood risk assessments dated May 2014. Estimating the contents loss, loss of function, and displacement cost are different depending on whether that building is located in areas subject to flooding by the base flood, known as Zone AE, and areas along coasts subject to flooding by the base flood with additional hazards, known as VE. This is due to differences in the flood hazard and the types of construction required in the floodplain regulations. For example, coastal areas that experience storm-induced waves in addition to flooding are VE zones. This is where the flood hazard includes waves 3 feet or more in height, which causes additional damages to buildings and infrastructure. Construction in Zone VE, or coastal floodplains, requires that buildings be constructed on piers, posts, or piles to better withstand storm surge, wave action, scour, erosion, and other effects of coastal flooding. Zone AE can be divided into two different types of floodplains. Coastal AE zones, in which the flood hazard includes waves less than 3 feet in height, and simply the AE zone, which was defined earlier. It's the zone that has no wave action. Recently, FEMA has become mapping what is known as the LMWA, the limit of moderate wave action. This area occurs in the coastal AE zone, but is where the flood includes waves of 1.5 feet high or less. FEMA recommends that buildings in coastal AE zones and within the LMWA be constructed similar to buildings in the V zones to account for the additional damages caused by breaking waves. Similarly, you may want to use the V zone loss estimation table for properties located in a coastal AE zone or within the LMWA. For A zones and flooding in areas other than coastal AEs and LMWAs, to estimate the content loss, use the table on this page to identify the flood depth and the type of building flooded. The content loss is equal to the contents value multiplied by the percent of contents damaged. For example, we estimated the contents replacement value of the residential building from the previous slide to be $50,000. Let's say the building is 1 story in height with no basement. If the base flood is 5 feet high, we can see that for this building, it is estimated that 45% of the building's contents will be damaged by a flood of that depth. So that's $50,000 multiplied by 0.45, which equals the estimated contents loss, or $22,500. To estimate the contents loss in V zones, the coastal A zone, and the LMWA, use the table on this page to identify the flood depth and type of building flooded. The content loss is equal to the contents value multiplied by the percent of contents damaged. For example, we estimated the contents replacement value of the residential building from the contents value slide to be $50,000. But instead of a 1-story building with a basement, let's say this building is constructed on an open foundation and has no obstructions. According to the National Flood Insurance Program's floodplain regulations, an obstruction is any construction element that is structurally dependent on, attached to the building, and located below the lowest horizontal structural member. Basically, any type of construction underneath an elevated building that prevents the free flow of water. Obstructions are not permitted in V zones because of the damage they can inflict upon the building when they are subjected to flood loads and wave action. The National Flood Insurance Program does allow for some use of the space below an elevated building, so long as it is constructed with non-supporting breakaway walls, open wood latticework, or insect screening, and intended to collapse under wind and water loads without causing collapse, displacement, or other structural damage to the elevated portion of the building or supporting foundation system. There may be buildings in the V zone that were constructed prior to the release of the first flood insurance rate map, and these buildings may not have been elevated or constructed with an open foundation, which is why there's a column for buildings with obstruction on the table. If the base flood is 5 feet, we can see that for a building without obstruction, it is estimated that 63% of the building contents will be damaged by a flood of that depth. So that's $50,000 multiplied by 0.63, which equals the estimated contents loss, or $312,500. Loss of function is also known as functional downtime. It is the average time during which a business, government, or other entity is unable to provide its services due to a natural hazard event. Functional downtime and displacement time were calculated for flood losses when your local hazard mitigation plan was written. These numbers do not appear in the plan itself, however, they were needed to calculate the loss information included in the plan. The information on functional downtime and displacement time, or even displacement costs for the base flood and other flood events, may be obtained by contacting your local Office of Emergency Management or GIS Department, or even the County Office of Emergency Management or the county's GIS Department. Both numbers should be obtained at once. If you are unable to gather this information through local contacts, you can research past floods or coastal storms in your jurisdiction and estimate the functional downtime and displacement time based on how long areas were impacted by the past events. Information on past events can be found in local news outlets, the National Hurricane Center website through NOAA, and on FEMA's website. There is also a table to estimate functional downtime for buildings located in Zone V, as depicted on this slide. Either way, loss of function is calculated by multiplying the average daily operating budget by the number of days the entity is unable to provide its services. To find the daily operating budget, divide the annual budget or sales by 365. An alternate method for estimating the loss of function cost for non-residential properties is to utilize the formulas developed by the City of Annapolis for their Cultural Resources Hazard Mitigation Plan. This formula is based on using the building square footage, which is called the above-grade enclosed area, as listed in the Maryland Department of Assessment and Taxation Real Property Database, multiplied by the industry average sales per month, multiplied by the number of months displaced. The industry average sales per month is a number that can be found through online research. The numbers utilized by the City of Annapolis are provided herein. The link to the Maryland Department of Assessment and Taxation Real Property Database is also provided on this slide. If you obtained displacement costs or displacement time from the county emergency manager, use those. If you need to estimate the displacement time, you can research past floods or coastal storms in your jurisdiction and estimate the time based on how long areas were impacted by the past events. Alternately, if your buildings are located in Zone V, you can use the table on this slide. Rent can be obtained through research on the internet to find average monthly payments. For example, the website city-data.com lists an average residential apartment rental of $918 a month. Displacement costs can also include a one-time cost to cover the cost of relocating and setting up in a new location. Once you've got the estimates for structure loss, contents loss, loss of function, and displacement costs, you add them together to get the total loss for the hazard event. FEMA 386-6, Integrating Historic Property and Cultural Resource Considerations into Hazard Mitigation Planning, has worksheets like these pictured on the slide. These worksheets can be used to record the loss and cost estimates. A best practice for calculating and recording the loss estimates is to have them in a spreadsheet or database that is linked to a GIS application that also shows the property's location and risk in relation to the hazard. The total loss should be calculated for each type of hazard event and adjusted accordingly. For example, if you are located in an area susceptible to flood, wildfire, and coastal erosion, you would have 3 different values for the total loss, one for each hazard event. HAZUS is a nationally applicable standardized method for estimating potential losses from earthquakes, floods, and hurricane winds using GIS technology. The software can estimate the physical, economic, and social impacts of disasters. It estimates the physical damage to buildings and infrastructure, estimates the cost of lost jobs, business interruptions, repair and reconstruction, and estimates the cost of shelter requirements, displaced households, and the population exposed to the scenario of floods, earthquakes, or hurricane winds. Using funding from FEMA's Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Fund, the Maryland Emergency Management Agency completed HAZUS scenarios for flooding in coastal areas throughout the state and made them available to counties for free to include in their local hazard mitigation plan. MEMA has also received funding through PDM to run HAZUS scenarios for areas susceptible to riverine flooding statewide. The riverine HAZUS runs will be completed by the end of 2017 and will be made available to county governments for free to include in their local hazard mitigation plans. Historic structures can be included in HAZUS scenarios. By importing a GIS layer of historic structures as a user-defined facility, jurisdictions can quickly and easily estimate the potential losses to their historic places. Bear in mind that the economic loss for historic structures generated by HAZUS will be based on the property value of the structures and will not account for their uniqueness or for their cultural or social value. Additionally, if importing GIS layers from the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, this layer will only contain known historic properties. More detailed guidance on estimating the economic impact for hazard events can be found in FEMA's mitigation how-to guides, in particular, volumes 2 and 6. Thank you for listening. Please contact me, Jen Sparrenberg, the Disembodied Voice, if you have questions or would like additional information or technical assistance with hazard mitigation planning for cultural resources. Keep checking our website as more informational modules will be available in the future.